Welcome, everyone, to the May 2026 meeting of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara, co-sponsored by the Free Thought Society. My name is Judy Flattery. I'm the president of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. We are a 501c3 educational corporation. We've been around since the mid-90s. We're 100% volunteer run. And if you're not familiar with humanism, humanism is a philosophy that rejects the supernatural and positively affirms our ability and our responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good of humanity. And one of the ways that we do that is by having these monthly speaker meetings with thought leaders on various topics of interest to humanists. Our website is sbhumanists.org, and you can read our newsletters going back to 2011 if you so choose on our website. We also have a meetup page which lists our events. And if you're interested in some of our speaker meetings, but you missed a session, we put them up on our YouTube channel. And finally, if you're interested in becoming a member of the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara, contact Mary Taylor at that email address. Margaret?
Well, hello, everyone. On behalf of the Free Thought Society and as its founder, as well as the current president, welcome to the May 2026 event featuring my friend David Orenstein. We are so pleased to be hosting this event with the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara. And like the Humanist Society of Santa Barbara, the Free Thought Society is a 501c3 educational nonprofit organization. We were founded almost 35 years ago. And you can find us on the web through the QR code that you see on the screen or at the address ftsociety.org. We also have a meetup page, and as you can see by the slide, the Free Thought Society also has a YouTube channel. And to thank you for attending today, the Free Thought Society is offering a complimentary e-zine, and that would be offered to anyone who's interested in what we advocate and what we do. We love to publish journey stories and other free thought or humanist related articles. So if you're a writer, please know that we would like to include your voice in a future publication. And thanks again for attending today. Now I'm going to share the introduction of Dr. David Orenstein with Judy Flattery.
Today, we are very pleased to be hosting Dr. David Orenstein. He is the department chair and a tenured full professor of anthropology at Medgar Evers College in the City University of New York. And he's been affiliated with the American Humanist Association, the AHA, for more than a decade and now serves on its board of directors. Dr. Orenstein's presentation is entitled Humanity's Debt to Africa, Evolution Humanism, and the Legacy of 8 Million Years of African Descent. In this talk, he'll guide us through the history of human evolution, describing the scientific evidence, as well as reviewing the pioneering researchers behind these discoveries. The presentation is designed to equip us with clear, accurate information that we can effectively communicate in discussions requiring a robust defense of evolutionary theory. Dr. Orenstein serves on the Smithsonian Institute Hall of Human Origins Broader Social Impacts Committee Board. That's a mouthful. He has taught human evolution, primatology, science history, and science advocacy. A primatologist by early training, he has written for numerous national and international freethinker and science publications.
And Dr.
Margaret?
Orenstein is the co-author of 2 books, and they are Godless Grace, How Believers Are Making the World Safer, Richer, and Kinder, and Darwin's Apostles, the man who fought to have evolution accepted, their times, and how the battle continues. He is also the author of a children's book entitled A Tale of Many Trees, The Story of Humanity. The book is about human evolution written for children in kindergarten through fifth grade. Dr. Orenstein is a noted civil and human rights activist representing the American Humanist Association at the United Nations through the non-governmental organization's Department of Public Information, which runs the civil society inclusion policy. Dr. Orenstein is also an ordained humanist chaplain. He has served on the board of several local and national organizations, including the Secular Humanist Society of New York and the Center for Free Thought Equality. In addition, Dr. Orenstein served as the American Humanist Association's representative to the United Nations for 5 years. Welcome, David.
Thank you very much. I have to say, I'd really like to meet this guy. And that was a fabulous introduction. Now I have anxiety. I have a lot to live up to, you know.
You'll do it. We love you.
Thank you. Thank you. It is lovely to be here serving both coasts this afternoon and this evening. Even though I'm a born New Yorker, I love Philadelphia. I absolutely love Santa Barbara and the West Coast. So when Judy and Margaret offered me the opportunity to speak, I said I would click my heels 3 times because there's no place like home, and I feel at home in both places. So thank you very, very much for the opportunity to speak on the Sunday where it's nice to be in community with people who are humanists, agnostics, atheists, questioners. When you think about what's happening in our society today, the concerns that we have about changes in governmental policy, even today, we have the Reclamation Day in Washington, D.C., where they're having this National Day of Prayer, funded in part by the government, your tax dollars, and support of the Christian nationalists to essentially say that America is a Christian nation. And so we, of course, know that that is not the case, and that we have to gird ourselves to continue to fight the good fight for the sake of secularism and knowledge. I'll stop there and start the presentation because I don't want to pontificate, but it's really important to be involved. And by coming to a program like this, you certainly are showing a level of involvement, and I really appreciate that. I might not see everybody's face here, but I do thank you and appreciate you for coming. So with that said, let me start the presentation. This is a 4-part presentation. It goes through the wisdom of natural selection, Darwin's life of times, the fossil evidence for our existence, and then wrapping it into what a humanist point of view should be to ensure that we can continue to speak the truth and support science in our efforts to understand not only the nature of the universe, but the nature of ourselves. So I start with the elegance of evolution. In a sense, the fundamental view that when we take an evolutionary point of view, whether we are formally trained in the science of natural selection or biology, evolution is a holistic science, meaning that it is all-inclusive. It is understanding that what operates naturally in the material world is understood through using the tools of science. That can be observation, that can be hypothesis building, that can be testing, that includes peer review, all the things that allow us to say with some strength to our ideas that we can understand the material world because we have developed the cognitive tools over a long period of time to do so. And so evolution is true because we have not only the theory, but we have the evidence, the biological evidence, the physical evidence, the fossil evidence, and so on and so forth. That evolution is not actually a theory. When we talk about the theory of evolution, we're not talking about an idea the way common people think about theory. We use the scientific view of theory. And in essence, we really should be talking about evolution as a law of nature, just like germ theory, just like any other theory that has been proven at this point beyond a shadow of a doubt and recognized in all aspects of the physical sciences as true, as historically understood, operationally, and that it is foundational to all of the sciences, including geology, biology, chemistry, and so on and so forth. And that this field of evolutionary biology is a pursuit that there's never a period at the end of the sentence, because we're constantly finding new evidence to either justify our understanding of the relationships of different fossils, or we are finding new material and evidence to help us better appreciate and understand not only where humans fit into the scheme of nature, but how we fit into essentially the universe. So it is both functional and it is fundamental. That is, if you have this core ability to look at things holistically, whether you're a scientist or not, if you accept evolutionary biology as something that is practical and taught for reasons, because they affect everything from pharmacology to game theory, and that the discipline, not even the field, but the discipline is connected across so many other scientific pursuits, and we'll see later how that actually plays out. So really, there are 6 tenets to really understanding natural selection as it relates to human evolution. And some of them are really meta. So we have to understand that evolution takes a long time, that it can't exist within a span of the begots, 10,000 years or something like that, that we know that evolution requires a long time to occur. And so based on what we know of the astronomical data, that the cosmos is 13.5 billion years old, our planet is 4.5 billion years old, of which for the first billion years of our planet's life cycle, nothing grew, not until we could have an oxygen atmosphere. And then eukaryotes eventually evolved. But that evolution is going on for billions of years, and it has created 3 fundamental laws, that is speciation, adaptation, and extinction. That is, an animal, whether it's a human or whether it's a precursor to our common humanity, whether it's a primate or whether it's a flea. Animals either speciate, meaning that there is a root animal that becomes another species or multiple species. Oh, somebody's birthday. They adapt, meaning that they stay within their niche or their geography and they change over time, but they don't actually change into other species. Or if they can't adapt, they will go extinct. And, we can get into the processes of things like gene flow and genetic drift, which are some of the mechanics of that, but that we understand that it's speciation, adaptation, and extinction are the main drivers of all natural selection. That we have been here on this planet for at least 350,000 years based on the fossil evidence, although there's new fossil evidence that actually may push us back to about 700,000 years. And I'll show that a little later. And that our species, we have been wanderers and nomadic for most of our existence on the planet. It's only in the last 10,000 years, maybe 8,000 years, when we invented city-states. But before that, we left Africa as Homo erectus did earlier than us, and we eventually populated the earth. And all of the human variation that you see, whether it be skin tone, hair color, eye color, height, all of those things are just variations on a theme, that we are all one species and that we are a very diverse species based on where our lineage comes from. And finally, that evolution doesn't really end. We know in our own time, we have vestigial structures. Our jaws are getting too thin, so we have to have our molars pulled out. We have a coccyx. At one point, it shows a lineage that connected us to having a tail. And that through all of this time, our species has adapted and changed over time. In fact, the interesting thing is our brain is actually getting more dense, which you might say is getting smaller, which is fascinating. You would think big brains, if you remember Star Trek, all the aliens always had these big, massive brains. And you think, oh my goodness, big brains equals super intelligence. Well, at least for our species, it seems to be the opposite, that the growth pattern of the human brain is actually getting tighter, not looser, that the synapses are getting closer. So really, in summary, all of natural selection, all of Darwinian evolution comes down to the idea that any population will change over time, and that traits that support these changes will promote survival. And those species or those individuals in that group who can reproduce and pass those traits forward will essentially maintain the species as it evolved in any particular niche or any particular environment. That is essentially, you don't have to read The Origin of Species now. I've given it to you in a paragraph. But read Origin of Species. It's actually a really good book. On the other hand, and it sort of goes back to where we find ourselves today with the desecration of science happening almost daily in our news feeds and funding sources, is this ascendance of idiocracy. If you've seen that movie, you'll get the reference. The point being is that if you are a creationist or support intelligent design, that regardless of all the science out there, you have to accept certain tenets in order for your ideas to be true. And they are an anathema to what we actually do in science, whether it's biology, chemistry, whatever field, geology, and so on and so forth. The first thing that you have to accept if you're a creationist is that the Bible is a science book. We know, going back to the Scopes monkey trial, that not only the idea of censoring the teaching of biology and natural selection has gone on in the United States and in other countries for decades, even through Kitzmiller versus the Board of Ed in Pennsylvania, that there's always this tendency to try to teach the idea that creationism and intelligent design are on equal footings with teaching actual science. And of course, every time that's come up, at least thank goodness in our time, it's been knocked down as being a form of religion, and we don't accept that. We don't teach religion in our science classrooms. We have to also accept, if you're a creationist, that the world is, regardless of all of the evidence, the paleontological evidence, the biological evidence, the cosmological evidence, that all of this is only 10,000 years old. And again, if that is the case, then evolution can't be true because evolution needs an awful long time. So these are the things that you have to accept. For many people, it might actually bring the hairs up on the back of your neck because you know that neither of these things are valid, that there is divine purpose to the world. And this is something, of course, that Carl Sagan always talked about as well, which is the idea that, well, if there's a divine purpose and plan, where is it? Where is this deity who is so perfect that has created us? And the reality is that it's the invisible fairies in my garage. That is, you may believe them, but they're not there. That somehow we are divined perfectly when we know that we're not. Why do we develop cancer? Why do we have heart problems? Why do people choke? There's so much bad design in the human body because it's a generalized design, as most primates, that there's obviously no designer. And if there is a designer, this guy should have lost his job, or this girl should have lost their job a long time ago. And you'll see this if you go to the Creation Museum. The innuendo is, and it's actually more than an innuendo, if you accept natural selection or evolution or, the truth behind modern science, that you're being fooled by the devil and that you are an instrument of evil. Anyone here an instrument of evil? Raise your hand. Okay, I admit I am an instrument of evil. Okay. And again, if you have a 10,000 year arc of the existence of humanity and the existence of the planet, and you have to fit it into an explanation, well, then Noah's flood explains geology and dinosaur history, even though we know that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago. And finally, and it sort of relates to point 3, is that there is a magical act that brought us into being. And again, I'm a practical person by nature. I like to see evidence, and I'm sure most of the people here in today's talk are the same way. If you want to believe in magic, that is your right. However, I think it is very unfulfilled because the beauty of science tells us more about the world in which we live and about ourselves than any deity or magical belief system could ever, in my opinion. Let me go through Darwin and his times. I wrote this book with Abby Hafer, who sadly passed away about a year ago. She's a wonderful anthropologist, biologist, and the world is a less happy place without Abby in it. And she would be very happy to be with you today. Sometimes we would tag team these programs, and I miss her very much. So the interesting thing is, like, if you ask people what are the concepts of science that really do frame our understanding of the nature of nature, and invariably it's the development at our earliest of things like fire, right? Because we can now control things. We now control the world rather than the world controlling us. The understanding of relativity, vaccination, the concept of zero, all of these things that we, both as laws and theories that we accept, often is the case, people will mention evolution within that as well. So evolution has a lofty place for those who, even if you've never studied evolution but are just curious about it, will hold an important place in all of humankind's ability to understand the nature of nature. Darwin himself is usually within the top 10 number of scientists when people say who's affected the world. In fact, I always like to share this. Time Magazine did this program and they did this survey. Now, of course, this is not a scientific survey, but Charles Darwin came in at number 12 of humanity's top 100 figures who have changed the world. I don't have a citation for you, but I will find it. I always like to do a mental exercise where I say if I take out the conquerors, the fascists, and the religious, that Darwin moves up from 12 to 6 in this line. So the importance of Charles Darwin is not to laud him because he was a man that had his foibles as well as his brilliance, but to understand that his work is seminal for us to understand both him and Alfred Russel Wallace. Their work is seminal for everything that came after related to biology, chemistry, geology, and so on and so forth, because understanding natural selection is a bedrock to understanding all of the other sciences. And the interesting thing is that in the West, we always tend to look at Darwin and Wallace as just sort of coming out of nowhere and with this grandiose idea and changing the world. But in reality, just like we are today, we stand on the shoulders of other people because nothing that is really good science is developed in a vacuum. So if you look at the Western side of the idea of evolutionary thought, not just natural selection, but evolutionary thought, you know it goes back thousands of years, actually. Anaximander talking about how humans arose from different types. I'll just put these all up here so you can see them. I don't necessarily have to read them. But you see that as far back as in BCE, that you have this idea that we transform, that the world of nature has no supernatural environment, that the anatomy of humans is neither unique or special. So that takes us out of the idea of divine creation. When you look at an anatomically modern human versus, let's say, a Neanderthal versus Lucy versus a chimpanzee, you see that the design, not the intelligent design, but the pattern of design exists over and over again. Nature loves a good pattern. But that's not just, we would be biased if we just talked about the Western ideas of natural selection because, in Asia and in the Arab world, there was discussion and talk of and philosophy about transformation, that the Arab scholars were talking about the struggle for existence, and that humans come from the world of monkeys. So you have all these breadcrumbs, all of these tidbits, all of these ideas showing up in our philosophy and in our science. Granted, in many cases, a lot of the people who are doing the research themselves are still religious. And we'll see in the next slide. But we see these fitful starts that we can imagine before we had the tools of science. We had the inferences that would show us that we are a part of nature and not above nature. And then, of course, you have a post-Enlightenment, Comte de Buffon, moving the scale of nature from this 10,000 years idea, this religious idea, to saying, oh, the world is actually 70,000 years old. You start to see this movement towards, oh, all of this evidence is showing up, and our philosophies and our religion isn't enough to tell us what's really happening here. This is before scanning electron microscopes and DNA and things like that. So we did a lot. Even Darwin didn't have the benefit of these things, but he had insight and he had observation. Linnaeus, of course, with the system of nature, classification of all species within larger and larger groups. Lamarckian evolution, the first idea of biology. Cuvier coming up with ideas of adaptation and evolution. Now, all of these men, including Erasmus Darwin, were deeply religious men. So they were confined by their theology to have to fit this nagging idea that nature is approaching and gnawing at what they accept as true. And then they're constantly trying to have to fit it into this wider view that the world is telling us more things as we become more scientifically based in our understanding of nature. And then there are two really very important geologists who played a huge role in Darwin's life. Adam Sedgwick, who before Darwin went on the voyage of the Beagle, was a teacher of Darwin, and they went to various places in England and looked at the geology. But Sedgwick was a transmutationist, and he was a very strong supportive colleague of Darwin until Darwin sent him a draft copy of Origin of Species. And then they were on very negative terms. At least Sedgwick was. The whole idea of transmutation is basically that there's some will behind the adaptation and nature of change, meaning that if a giraffe thinks hard enough and wants to eat higher parts of the tree, that if they keep stretching their neck and hoping that their neck gets longer, that they'll that consciousness on to the next generation, and the next generation will have a longer neck to get to the top of the tree. Not, as Darwin showed, that the way natural selection works is that genes that are passed down in a given environment, if they help a giraffe reach the topiary of a tree because there's better fruit there, if those random genes mutate and they show up in enough of the population, then those genes will survive because then that species is putting their genes into the next generation. The next geologist is Lyell, whose principles of geology Darwin took with him on the voyage of the Beagle and were really important for him to understand stratigraphy and the way that regions and geology get stratified, where you have the oldest on the bottom and the youngest on top of any particular strata, unless, of course, there's some type of catastrophe. Lyell also was not a supporter of The Origin of Species when it first came out, but eventually became one of Darwin's main advocates. In fact, he once wrote to Darwin, and if you ever want to see what it was like, Darwin was really the central figure in so many different sciences. There's something called the Darwin Correspondence Project, and you can actually read all of there was no email. You wrote letters in the 19th century to each other. And Darwin had, with social scientists, with physical scientists, these long letter writing campaigns over his life. So Lyell said in one of his letters, rather dryly, something to the effect is, I can't imagine this because I'm just not able to accept it, but I understand it and I respect what you've written, Charles, and therefore I have to accept it. So even though he was, I wouldn't necessarily say critical of Darwin, he eventually, in fact, it was Lyell and Joseph Hooker who in 1858 took the paper of, I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me just keep going here. And then, of course, there's Charles. Now, the sad thing about Charles Darwin is that although he was respected in many, many circles, he was for the longest time belittled, made a laughing stock, treated really poorly. As late as almost 3 years before Darwin. Darwin died in 1882. In the Hornet, which was a British publication, this was the picture of Charles Darwin that was still in the popular press. Even though he was making these fantastic, life-altering understandings for all of us, he was still defamed in many places, certainly within the church, and certainly in a lot of public opinion. In Victorian England, the occult was masterful. If you wanted to be part of the aristocracy or join the aristocracy, you have to have seances. You have to have tarot card readings. It was respectable. And so when Darwin's coming out with all of his research and saying that this magic isn't true, the elites really did not like what Darwin wrote. They didn't like what he wrote also because what he essentially said was, if we evolved and we are all equal, then there's no reason for a country to own another country or for a person to own another person. And for those who are in power, that was shocking. What do you mean? The sun doesn't set on the British Empire. We have a God-given right to take over people's land, and so on and so forth. So Darwin came from a very wealthy family, but he wasn't part of the aristocracy. When Darwin went to school, there were really three things that if you were not an elite and a member of royalty, but you were a person of means, you either became a barrister, you became a doctor, or you joined the clergy. So Darwin started his academic career in medicine, but couldn't stand the sight of blood. So ultimately, Charles Darwin leaves college with a degree in theology. Darwin, when he left college, was a theologian. Ironic, wouldn't you say? Of course, then in 1832, he goes on the voyage of the Beagle. Darwin was incredibly shy. He had writings and publications, but he was not a public speaker. He hated public speaking. He hated the idea that his work would create so much conflict that he didn't want to withstand the slays and arrows of scientists who were religious, the clergy who would fight back at the idea of natural selection, and even his colleagues who wouldn't accept it. In his own life, his wife was a very religious woman and waxed that she was afraid that Darwin's work would stop him from them joining each other in heaven. And so he had conflict at home as well as within society. So much so that I think one of the reasons why it took him more than 20 years to publish The Origin of Species was simply because he didn't want to face any criticism from the world. And these are some of the men who I highlight in Darwin's Apostles. Joseph Dalton Hooker, who was a botanist and the leader of the Kew Gardens in London, was a lifelong friend of Darwin. T.H. Huxley, who was also known as Darwin's bulldog, was an advocate for Darwin. Asa Gray, who was an American, who was a deeply religious man, but saw the immense value of Darwin's work and actually got what was the equivalent of the copyright of Origin of Species in the United States for Charles Darwin. Of course, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was the co-discoverer of natural selection, younger than Darwin. In fact, it was Wallace who sent a 20-page paper to Darwin saying, hey, I've been doing all this work in South America, and I think I figured out the mechanism for how species adapt and change and evolve. And Darwin went white when he read it because Darwin had a 400-page book that would be Origin of Species that he refused to publish. And he wrote to, I think it was Hooker, saying, what this young man has done in 20 pages, I've done in 400 pages. And he's ready to publish. What do I do? And then there's John William Draper, who is British, who came to America and was a real Renaissance person, first person to photograph the moon. He was the first president of NYU Medical School, and he was an advocate for Darwin as well, both in England and in the Americas. Now, this doesn't mean that there weren't other people who were advocating for Darwin as well, but these five men really, because again, Lyell certainly did, were really the men who supported Darwin, who actually debated for Darwin, because Darwin never debated, and who actually made sure that the idea of natural selection did not die in the cradle. That when Darwin and Wallace gave birth to this idea, it could have been very easily killed off. but they made sure through their writings, through their speeches, through their debates, that natural selection would take hold, and by golly, it did. And then, of course, again, Darwin and Wallace wrote this joint paper under the auspices of Lyell and Hooker to the Linnaean Society in June of 1858. Origin of Species was published November of 1859, saying, this is the mechanics of nature. We have discovered it, and we are going to formally show the world. So it was the combined chapters of Darwin's work along with Wallace's 20-page paper. And that became, in essence, the quinceanera, the coming out party, if you will, of natural selection. Again, Origin of Species comes out in 1859, sells out within its first publication in one day. And then in June of 1860, there's the great Huxley-Wilberforce debate at Oxford University, where not only Huxley spoke, but Hooker spoke and Draper spoke as well. They were sort of the undercard match, if you will, if you don't mind a boxing analogy, where, of course, Huxley just wiped the floor with Bishop Wilberforce, really did help solidify making sure that Origin of Species and natural selection would not be swept under the rug of the religious intelligentsia of the time. And at the same time, you have these incredible things happening, right, in the 19th century. You have the women's suffrage movement, anti-slavery movement. It was a time in the 19th century where there was so much happening. Automation, child labor laws, unionization, formal education, where kids don't go to factories and mines at 6 years old, but they go to school. This idea of democratization of access to information to be part of a larger society, penal reform, so on and so forth, that natural selection fits into this world really nicely, because as societies were changing, the ideas of nature were changing at the same time. 75 years later, you have Theodoros Dubinsky, who's a Polish, I believe, biologist, who basically says nothing in biology could make sense except in the light of evolution. Carl Sagan, years later, said the same thing, that evolution and natural selection are the building blocks of our understanding of biology and chemistry and all of nature. And that if you take evolution out, everything else falls. It's like Jenga. You ever play Jenga where you pull out the pieces? So if you take that out, everything collapses. There's also another great quote from The Wisdom of David Attenborough. He was asked by Anderson Cooper, maybe you've seen this, what book has influenced you the most? And he snapped. He didn't even wait. He said, The Origin of Species. So the works are important to not only the literary, but to the material understanding of the world. I'll end this section, God is dead, Nietzsche's dead, God. But what Nietzsche was basically saying is the same thing that T.H. Huxley said, that Darwin killed God. But what Nietzsche was basically saying, it's not that God is dead. It's that we don't need God. And that in the absence of God, we only have ourselves to depend on to help understand the world. It's a very humanistic, actually, idea that if there isn't God, then morality, science, nature, how we treat each other is then a human construct rather than an immortal one based on divinity. When Nietzsche said God is dead, he didn't mean that God lived and then he died. He meant that we are God and that we must control the world in the best way possible, not in any fascistic way. Part 3 is where I'd like to really focus on the evolutionary record. So we've talked about the baseline, that we have to understand evolution, that we have to understand it's a long process, that we have to understand that itself had to go through machinations over time and distance, with a lot of players coming up with the fundamental mechanics of what we teach in school today. But that what stands the test of time, especially related to our own human evolution, is the fact that we have both the biological evidence and the fossil evidence to say beyond a shadow of a doubt that not only is evolution true, but we can show it, and we can show it functionally. In fact, when Darwin wrote this in his notebook, and this is very famous, where he says, I think, where he came up with the idea that species speciate or they adapt or they go extinct. This is one of the original things, and you may have seen it. I took the liberty on the right to actually show not so much the tree, but the bush, going back to at least Australopithecines, of the intricacies of all of the hominin species that have existed on the planet, some close to us within the last 35,000 years before dying out. Some we have the genes to prove that we have Neanderthal genome within us. And so you can see the intricacies of where and how not only species existed, but how they are related to one another. It's not a perfect chart. It's definitely version 1, but it tries to show that not only did we have European Neanderthals, but we had Asian Neanderthals and what speciated onto that, so on and so forth. As I mentioned earlier, when science holds evidence as truth, it's based on the fact that it's tested and observed and peer reviewed and understood as this is the best understanding the nature of nature at this point. It may change, but we have the evidence to say this is what we accept as currently true. Now, this is the mitochondrial flow of genes, mitochondrial DNA found exclusively females. And you can see the earliest mitochondrial DNA comes from Africa. If you follow all of the lines, you'll see that it's starting in Kenya and Ethiopia and in areas around there. We know also in Morocco, there's evidence. So this is one layer of our understanding of how we left Africa, how our species left Africa. And wouldn't you know, how many people remember when you would use overhead projectors and you'd put a layer down and then you put another layer down and so on and so forth? This is the overhead projector of this. This is the out of Africa evidence of the fossils. This is the mitochondrial DNA. They are almost an exact match. So when you have more than one science telling you the same thing, the level of understanding and acceptance is much higher because it's based on evidence, man. It's not based on, I hope it's this way or I think it's this way. It's based on, look at what I can produce in a laboratory or in an experiment, and I can have my colleagues review it and say that this is accurate. This is peer review. Unlike intelligent design, there are books on intelligent design that can fill a library. The problem with intelligent design is that it's not peer reviewed and that it's theology. The other thing that's really fascinating is that if you go to any natural history museum, you'll see the usual suspects. You'll see the Australopithecines, the Homo erectus, Neanderthals, all the other subspecies. And what's important to understand is that the likelihood of anything being fossilized is incredibly, incredibly small. That is, just the nature of something being fossilized is so rare that we have any evidence from the fossil history of our existence is fascinating. In fact, I offer you this chart. There were probably, even with all the variety of Australopithecines that there were, probably no more than 3,000 Australopithecines ever. And that they might have been around for about 3 million years, but we only have fossil specimens of about 300. And we could look at Homo habilis, which is the first true line anatomically modern humans. Again, a population of maybe no more than 1,000, and so on and so forth. So you can see that we say, well, why do we have gaps in the fossil record? Well, it's because in the first place, it's really hard for things to become fossilized. And in the second place, the likelihood of fossilization is so rare that given small populations, their numbers get infinitesimally very, very small. So it's a messy record. It's a record with a lot of also rans. Even this chart is, I may take it out after this because it seems to say that Afarensis led to Africanus, and I don't like that because it's a bush, it's not a line. But you can see some of the species, and I have some of them here to share with you. So we could really go back into the fossil record and really look at primates at about 23 in the Miocene. But that's not really the purpose of this talk today. I want to focus more exclusively on roughly the last 7 to 8 million years of our antecedents that brings us to us. One of the first really important fossils, and it was right after the break between the line from apes to all of the lines that would eventually lead to hominins, anatomically modern humans, right? The Australopithecines and all of the Homo line is a Sahelanthropus. Now, there's no postcranial remain, but the interesting thing about Sahelanthropus is, and I have him for you here. The first thing that really shows that it's on the human line are two things. This is a modern common chimpanzee. So what's interesting about Sahelanthropus is that A, its dentition, no fangs. All apes in the ape lineage have fangs. You see a huge reduction in that here. The other thing that shows what probably is the earliest form of bipedalism, that is walking on 2 feet, you find in Sahelanthropus because of the position of the foramen magnum. Now, if you look at a chimpanzee, which is really a quadruped, you notice that where the spine goes into the brainstem here is sort of at the more of the rear of the skull. In dogs, it would be here because they're four-legged, right? But you find with Sahelanthropus right here, almost at the base. And this is a strong leading indicator that this species of hominin, which would eventually lead to us, was the majority bipedal by 7 to 8 million years ago. Here is Australopithecus ramidus. And this is also, now this is 4.5 million years. You see the dentation is very chimpanzee-like, or actually, it's like a U, but you see very low canines. You have a brain of about 500 cc's. And most importantly, you see directly but evidence for bipedalism. And you can see that, I mean, this is us, right? So this is, and this is one of my students who didn't do well in my class. So there, oh, can I tell you a funny story? I have two funny stories, and I'll tell them quickly. So the first is, I'm taking all of these fossils, skulls, and I teach in Brooklyn, in an area that is gentrifying, but is a relatively rough neighborhood. So I've got this box of skulls that I'm walking from one building to the other, and I'm stopped by the police who thought that they had caught a serial killer, obviously. Until I showed them my ID card and showed them that these weren't, these are casts, and then they let me go. It was only in Brooklyn. And the other thing, so I took the majority of these skulls, a lot of them to me when I gave a talk similar to this in Poland about a year ago. And because I was so afraid that I didn't want to lose these things, that I took them as my carry-on. And I went through TSA screening, and I realized, oh my God, they're going to see all these skulls when they put it through the X-ray that they're going to stop me. So I went through, wouldn't you know, it went through, nobody batted an eye. And I said, it's okay, these aren't real. And the woman looked at me, she said, honey, What comes through here, this is the least of our problems. So those are my two stories about my wandering minstrel show of carrying hominids with me wherever I go. At the same time, you have these species, and before you even get to Australopithecines, you have guys like this. So this guy's not even on the line of Australopithecine or the line to chimpanzee or anything like that. It's another one floating around there in Africa that is an evolutionary dead end, and this is Kenyanthropus plotiops. So he's not related to Australopithecines at all, but he's existing about the same time as Australopithecines, or maybe a little bit before. But again, an evolutionary dead end. You either speciate, you adapt, or you go extinct. Before we even get to Lucy, the question is what came before Lucy, right? Because Lucy didn't just get dropped here by aliens, right? We were not seeded, although some people believe that. Again, we need the evidence. You have Australopithecus anamensis, which is 3.8 million years old. And she is the precursor to all of the Australopithecines. She is the root ancestor, or he is the root ancestor at this point in our knowledge to what would eventually lead to the Australopithecines. Let me bring out Lucy. This, of course, is Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis. And you know the story how she got her name? So Don Johansson, if you ever read the book on Lucy, he was in Ethiopia, and Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was playing when she was
Oh,
here. Yeah. To me, you can't do better than that. But if I were to pick a Beatles song to talk about human evolution, it would have to be The Long and Winding Road, simply because of all of the nature of how things change. Oh, thank you. So again, foramen magnum, definitely bipedal, living before our young Lucy. The fascinating thing about Lucy, of course, is that in most cases, all we have is the skull. Lucy is one of the first early hominins where we have postcranial evidence, long bones, pelvis, backbone, spine, arms, right? 3.5 feet tall. She must have been quite a beauty. But again, you see on the road to what would eventually be a speciation event where Homo habilis would arise, the Palatine area is still very chimpanzee-like. It's like a U. If you look at anatomically modern humans, not so at all. So if there are any dentists in the audience, I thank you for all your hard work. And so Lucy's running around in at this time. At the same point, or actually just a few million years later, you have the Australopithecus africanus, larger brain, rounder brain, more human-like dentition, bipedalism, and this was found by Lucy by the Leakeys. Here, if you've never seen, this is Town Child, who is a baby Australopithecine. He or she may have been about 6 years old at the time of her death, found in 1925 by the paleontologist Raymond Dart. Fascinating. But you can see the emergence of a more human-like round palatine and very similar dentition to later anatomically modern humans. So you see a lot of changes going on in this species. At the same time, just like with anatomically modern humans, you have Neanderthals and you have Denisovians and all these other Homo species running around. At the same time, there were a variety of Australopithecines, including this guy. This is Australopithecus robustus. So there are two forms of evolutionary dead ends, if you will, of Australopithecines: the robust and the gracile. Now, if you look, definitely bipedal, but what these guys were eating were thick tubers. They were biting nuts. They were basically nutcrackers. If you look at what's fascinating here, the mid-sagittal crest, so the muscle attachments that must have gone to the jaw in order to, masticate were intense, very much like an anatomically modern gorilla. I mean, if you notice, no fangs, right? No canines, where a gorilla has a canine. But the whole idea, again, nature solves the same problem in many different ways. So here are other robust Australopithecines. So they're all running around about the same time. And if you look back at this chart, you get a more of an appreciation where they're all meeting up in some cases. And then, of course, eventually we find the first Homo line, Homo habilis, handyman, a larger brain. Now we're talking about real brain power here. You're talking 600 to 800, 700 cc's. You see a much flattening of the palate. You see almost a human-like dentition. And you find the first evidence of tool making when we get to Homo habilis. There is, of course, some evidence that much later Australopithecines were making some rudimentary Otawan tools, but we know for sure that Homo habilis, known as handyman, was actually making the first tools, scrapers, hammers, so on and so forth. So bigger brain means a lot more stuff that you can imagine and think about. Um, and so the other interesting thing is that, for the longest time there was this debate in anthropology. Well, what came first? Bipedalism or big brains. And the reality is we can go all the way back to the earliest Australopithecines, and even before that with Sahelanthropus 7 million years ago, at just the break between what would eventually be the chimpanzee line, and see that bipedalism came way before, millions of years before brain evolution did. This is African Homo erectus. Homo erectus was the first species of its kind to actually leave Africa. So it migrated into Europe and Asia. You find Homo erectus in Israel, you find it in Palestine, you find it in Asia, you find Homo erectus in Europe. In fact, it was either Homo erectus or Homo habilis who responsible for later Neanderthals. So there's a debate. Was it this guy? This is Asian Homo erectus, Peking man. So here's two of them. And look at the size of the brain capacity. Now we have evidence of fire with Homo erectus. We have evidence of rudimentary, not necessarily campsites, but the intentional taking of stones and building them up as a wind blocker. You have, and this is all of Homo erectus. So they were all generalized, but doing these wonderful tools, very fine tool making by this point. You probably have language at this point. It's no longer or like call systems like the way other animals have, but you're actually probably seeing the rudimentary language by the time we get to Homo erectus. And before we get to Neanderthals, who are our cousins, and by the way, if you are from Europe or from Asia, you have a percentage of Neanderthal DNA. Do your 23andMe. You will see. So this is Homo hybridgenesis, who may be the root ancestor of both Asian and European Neanderthals. Um, for the longest time, it was like, well, why are there no Neanderthals in Africa? Right? They're represented in Europe, then they're represented in Asia. Well, it's because this species of hominin and Homo erectus was in Europe and Asia. So the idea is that Homo erectus and possibly Homo hybridgenesis are the root ancestors to both Asian and European Neanderthals. So of course, in the Pleistocene, if you look at modern Eskimos, you see that they're built for cold weathers. These are cold weather built hominins. Their nasal passages are wider to take in more air because the air is thinner. They're thicker. Their bones are thicker. Everything about them is built for winter. And so, there are several ideas of why Neanderthals died out, right? It was that we interbred with them. It was that, anatomically modern humans are on the scene and we are just outbuilding them. We have a higher birth rate. The temperature's changing, where if you're built for cold adaptations, and now it's getting warmer. If you can't evolve and adapt quickly enough, the answer is extinction. And in reality, it's probably multiple things that led to the extinction of the Neanderthals. So when I went to school back in when the dinosaurs ruled, all you had was, oh yeah, you had Neanderthals, and of course, then you had modern humans and so on and so forth. And of course, it gets thicker because then you find these guys, Homo florensis in Asia, right? Dying out only about 35 to 50,000 years ago. Right? You have the Denisovians. Their genetics are a mixture of several aspects of the Homo line plus Australopithecine. So God only knows how they got, and I say God only knows facetiously. I'm sorry, I'm from New York. This is how we talk. I'm saying. And so you see that there's a lot of contributing factors here. The first evidence of our species. We lived in Africa from about 350,000 years ago to about 90,000 years ago, almost exclusively. If you look at the first 4 points, you see the time get ticked back with every new find. And again, this is what happens when you find new fossils. It's like, okay, something replaces something else. We have to change the timeline. We have to change how we understand what's happening. Lo and behold, just this year, new evidence has come back, also from Morocco, which pushes back our lineage, Homo sapien, archaic Homo sapiens, to about 770,000 BCE. It almost doubles the timeline from when anatomically modern humans or are very close to archaic humans existed on the planet. This is me holding the jaw of this species. And, when you get two old paleontologists together, we don't talk about sports. We don't talk about, we get really happy with fossils. And so that's Rick Potts, who is the head of the Smithsonian Human Origins program at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. A year and a half ago, I held that critter in my hand and he said, not a word. It's still being written about. but it's going to come out soon. And just a few months ago, it came out that the evidence for the paper finally came out in Nature, pushing back our lineage to 770 million years ago. By the way, I apologize. It's the same jacket and shirt. I don't know why that I wear. And wait, even the same jeans, I think. I don't know. I promise you, I do change my clothes. I am part of society. So then, of course, you have Florensis, you have Denisovians, you have all of these other also ran species that are floating around up until about 35,000 years ago. And we are the last hominin standing. Homo sapiens sapien are the last of our species that we know of. If there's a find somewhere, it will be fascinating. But everybody, no matter how different we look, every human on the planet today owes their antecedents, owes their history to several of the fossils that I've shared with you here, and shows, in fact, that we are indeed one human family, one human species, and all of the variation is actually good, because if we all look the same, and what natural selection has taught us time and time again, if our genome got lazy and there was something catastrophic in our environment, the less flexibility we have in our genome, the more chance of extinction. So the fact that even though we're 99.9999999% exactly the same in such an infinitesimal small amount of genetic material has created all of this human variation, that this human variation is a plus, not a negative. So let's go DEI, please. As time gets short, let me put the bow on it and why this is important to know. Why is it important to know natural selection? Why is it important to understand our human connection to nature? Aside from the fact that, oh, it's fun to know and you might be the life of a party or you have something to say with a drink in your hand. It's because it's deeper than that. It's the idea that science and democracy are DNA strands, and that they are connected to each other, and that you really can't have one without the other to have a functioning society, because they depend on each other for truth and decency and justice. So really what I think of when I think about humanism in relation to what I know about natural selection is that we accept science over superstition. That is, we do not go to the Creation Museum and say, that's right. Right? We share in empathy because we understand that intolerance is antithetical to our human existence and our human ability to live and pass down our genes in a better way than being intolerant to one another. That we choose expertise and not dumb down our ideas or our society because it's convenient to politically make people feel good about themselves because they may not have this knowledge. That is, we favor expertise. We understand that people who go to school or just have a drive to learn and be curious, that is actually a really good thing. We wouldn't be where we are today if we didn't have those things. And that we look for, not necessarily demand, but certainly look for and seek out truth over lies. And we call truth to power when we hear these things. And finally, that we debate facts rather than opinions. I can't tell you how many times I have been asked to debate creationists, and I never debate a creationist. I never go on anyone's show. I never go on their YouTube channel. I'm not giving anybody oxygen to spout their foolishness. It would just be the worst thing, because it's a gotcha anyway, plus the fact that I'm not there to make somebody else richer. And so thank goodness we have the National Secular Society. We have people going back and recognizing for generations, whether it's Ingersoll or Dawkins or the American Humanist Association or American Atheist or a whole litany of alphabet free thought organizations who fight, the Secular Coalition for America, for the idea that we must understand democracy and respect science and make sure that we have those together, because a knowledgeable, informed populace is a better society. And as Bertrand Russell said, without science, democracy is impossible. Of course, we have people in the ether. The church is supposed to direct the government. The government is not supposed to direct the church. I'm tired of all this separation of church and state junk. Think about it. Right now, maybe it's over. I'm not sure. But in DC, they're having this rededication to the United States being a Christian nation when that's just not the truth, right? You have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's recently seen the light, but I don't know how much of that is true. You have Eric Adams, when he was mayor of New York, saying that he can't separate his religiosity from the functioning of his management of the government. So it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats too. You don't have to have an R or a D next to your name to be a religious fascist. You have ID legislation from then Rick Santorum. All this money for community and faith development initiatives, your tax dollars from the federal government going in to support these things. I really do think that when you have anti-democratic movements like you have in the United States right now, whether we call it fascistic or whether we call it authoritarianism, they are anti-democratic movements. And all they are doing is giving the ignorant a platform to spread their ignorance. And that's incredibly dangerous because we're looking at the Dunning-Krugerization of the United States. Dunning-Kruger, where people who think they know the most, but actually know the least, are in charge of our military, of our science, of our health, of our government at this point, and it is scary. And we are seeing wars and violence and people not having health care and ivermectin over and over again. And you realize that the guardrails that have been around are not there, except we are the guardrails. We have to be in the humanist, atheist, rationalist community, have to be the guardrails. We have to have skin in the game in order to be good citizens. Because really, if you go to the Creation Museum, it's basically the Flintstones. Now, I loved the Flintstones growing up. Wilma, it was basically the Honeymooners, right? But in cartoon form. So I could love the Flintstones and see the humor in it, but if you believe that velociraptors were around with anatomically modern humans, you've gone off the deep end and you're not using any type of human wisdom or logic or reason because, as we've seen in the presentation and beyond that in our own lives, what's real and what's make believe. But yet we do have the idea of Genesis and the Big Bang, the Bible code, all these different things that are trying to whittle their way into secular parlance to give the resemblance of honesty and truth when in fact there is no honesty and truth in any of this. So Carl Sagan said it best, and I won't read it to you, but I'll leave it up here and you can go back to this if you want to stop. But we need to have a humility and a community spirit to understand scientific method and how the Bill of Rights are linked as they're linked to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And as Christopher Hitchens said, another person whose loss to our movement is greatly felt, that what can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence. So if anyone tries to use their however highfalutin or scientifically sounding ideas about intelligent design and creation as it might be seen, in the end, it's all theology and it's all flim-flam and it's a grift. So I leave you with this, and these are really my final thoughts, is that in our movement, certainly at the AHA and in all of the organizations I've had a pleasure to speak with and the people I've gotten to know, many of you in this meeting here, many of you who I hope will be able to see each other or communicate. I'm a big fan, just to let you know. You have my contact information. I hope you can always ask for it, or you can find me on Facebook or whatever. Let this be the start of a conversation. If you ever have questions about any of this stuff, I'm always available. Just an email or a phone call away. Unlike Darwin, we don't have to write each other flowery letters. You can just shoot a quick email. But I think it's really important that we understand that it's not that what's happened in the movement that matters most. It's really what we do next. We can't rest on our laurels, and we can't opine for days like the Reason Rally, and which were great. I mean, I love them, But you can't live in the past if you're going to effectively plan for the future. And as humanists and rationalists and non-believers, whatever label you might have yourself or no label, you have to understand it's really what you do as much as you can do that makes a difference. So if you can give money, but you can't give your time, do that. If you can give your time, but not your money, do that. Add your flavor to the movement because that's what really matters. If you're good at writing or you're good with technology and you can't do anything else, give that to an organization because that is the type of dignity and compassion and rational free thought that will help us get to the next generation. And with that, I thank you for your time and attention, and it has been lovely shouting at you for the last hour and a half.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank
Sure.
you,
I heard
David.
your call to action there. And yeah, I think for myself, I'm often much more comfortable. Let me learn some more about it because, that Dunning-Kruger, I mean, I know what I don't know. And
Right.
I'm sometimes maybe reluctant to take a stand because maybe somebody else knows more. And I think we have within this movement, that may be a common experience. But I'm
Sure.
hearing you say that we need to take advantage of the opportunities to stand up, to speak out, because we're the guardrails. I
Yes.
get that. I get
Yes.
that.
Absolutely.
Um, One question was someone was wondering about the teeth, all the teeth that you showed in the skulls you showed, and
Mhm.
they're wondering, so all these species, were they herbivores, were they carnivores, were they omnivores? What was the purpose of the canines? Was it to show threat, or did they actually, can you say something about the teeth and what the teeth tell us?
Sure, sure, sure. Okay, so now we know that just because you have big teeth doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a monster and you're going to eat flesh, right? So here's gorillas who are vegetarians,
Hmm.
right? So it's almost a dissonance because why would you need big teeth like that if you're not going to like be like a lion in the jungle, right? But again, this is of course for sexual dimorphism. So this is a male gorilla, and this is probably for threat, why it still exists. When you look at this guy, Australopithecus robustus, again, the same remarkable features, right? But if you notice, no fangs, it's because this guy was just basically eating tubers. He was not a meat eater. Okay. For the most case, early Australopithecines were probably scavengers more than anything else, right? So they're not forming hunting parties. You're not having that happen until probably at least Homo erectus, where there's planning and there's cooking of meat. If they were omnivores, if they got protein, let's say an Australopithecine versus Homo erectus or Homo habilis, and also was probably happening upon it more than anything else. So their diets were basically nuts, fruits, berries, things like that that are found easily to pull off a tree or to pull off of a branch or something like that. And if they got what's called an infusion of protein, animal protein, it was probably by accident because don't forget, especially with those Australopithecines, they're not cooking their meat, right? So who knows what their digestion is like, you know? Um, and then the other place that they're getting their protein is from bugs. So they're eating a lot of uh, small bugs, gnats,
Hmm.
um, things like that.
As one does, yes.
Yeah, yeah, which is still being done today.
Okay,
I was
great.
down in
We had
Ecuador.
another,
Yeah.
I was saying there was another question. You mentioned speciation events. What is the definition of a speciation event or an example of one?
Okay, so a great speciation event is the branching out. A speciation is basically a branching out from one root ancestor into other distinct species. A species, of course, is defined as a population that breeds within itself and can have offspring that they themselves can breed. So a good one would be, let's say, Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis giving rise to Neanderthal species.
So you're saying
Rather,
that all of a sudden we notice there's another species. We might not know what was the moment in time or the thing that happened that had it cross the line from
right. I mean,
being
there
the
could
same
be,
species to another.
periods of like here in particular, right? So if you're looking at speciation events, depending on where you have a clean cut, right? So the Denisovians and both European and Asian Neanderthals have a root ancestor of either Homo erectus or Homo heidelbergensis. And so that is a speciation event where one species gives rise to multiple
Mm.
species. Where you have, let's say, Asian Neanderthals giving rise to three very important Asian subspecies, Homo longi, Homo florensis, and Homo luzon in the Philippines, right? So here is where Neanderthal is now having a speciation event, and it is adapted from and has lived in Asia for up through its entire evolutionary history. At the same time, it's giving rise to at least three other subspecies. And you can see roughly the dates when those things happen. Now, it could happen for a lot of different reasons, right? So you could have, let's say, you have a tree falls in a wood and it blocks a river, and now fish that usually would mate with each other can no longer mate together and they become breeding isolates. And now they're following their own evolutionary path now because they are no longer together and have access to each other. They may adapt or speciate into whole other species. And you find this over and over and over again, which is why there's 1,000 different kinds of beetles.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's see. I think Robert, do you have a question?
Yeah, so the title was all about Africa. Is there something really special about Africa? Do we even know that humans didn't also evolve in other places?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, again, if you look at the mitochondrial and fossil evidence, the earliest evidence for our species finds itself in Africa. So that makes Africa a very, very special place because it's not only a place where anatomically modern humans arose, it's where all these other species arose, where the Australopithecines lived, evolved, and died, where earlier species that would eventually lead to the higher primates lived, adapted, speciated, and died. So Africa has gone through tremendous change from forestations to deciduous forests to deserts to so on and so forth, and with it all of the open savannas, and with that climate change and change in geography comes all of the species. So we owe our existence, quite literally, to an African primate.
Great. Thank you. I think with that, we'll just thank you so much for
Sure.
sharing all this with us, for your preparation, your generosity. And
And
I
your great
invite,
personality.
Oh,
oh, that personality, yeah, and the
stop.
wardrobe
Okay,
and all the
keep going, keep
shares. We
going. I
really
like it
like all
now.
that. No, really, and your sense of humor, very,
Oh,
very much appreciate that.
and your collection. Oh my
Oh.
gosh, you blew me away. This is fantastic.
Incredible. Thank you to my friend Margaret, and we appreciate all of you spending this time with us today.
Thank you. Good night, everyone.